For decades they warned me the world outside the Kingdom Hall was darkness, but no one told me about the shadows inside. I was 22 when a spiritual man knocked and almost shattered my faith, my marriage, my voice. What they buried for years finally surfaced, and it wasn't pretty until I spoke for good. I never imagined that a simple girl from a small town in São Paulo, who grew up believing that the world outside our Kingdom Hall was pure darkness, would one day find the courage to speak about the shadows that existed within what I thought was light itself. My name is Helena Santos, and I'm 67 years old. Every morning, when I make my coffee and sit by the window of my little apartment, I watch the neighbors going about their daily lives, and I think about how different my life could have been if I had understood earlier that fear disguised as faith is still just fear. I was born in 1956, right here in Santo André, in a simple house with a small garden where my mother grew roses and mint. My father worked at the metallurgy plant. My mother was a seamstress who took in clothes to alter. We were regular Catholics, you know? We went to Mass on Sundays, prayed before meals, hung a Sacred Heart of Jesus picture in the living room. It was a peaceful life, predictable, safe. But everything changed in 1978 when I was 22 years old. I had just married Roberto, a good man, quiet, who worked as a mechanic at a local garage. We were setting up our little house, dreaming about children, planning our future together. It was during those early months of marriage that two women knocked on our door one Tuesday afternoon. I can still see them clearly. Sister Carmen, an elegant woman in her 40s, with hair always perfectly combed, wearing a navy blue dress that reached exactly to her knees, and Sister Rosa, younger, recently married like me, with a sweet smile that won me over immediately. They spoke with such conviction, my dears, explaining the Bible in a way that made so much sense that I thought, how come no one ever taught me this before? We started Bible studies every Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. I would prepare a little coffee, serve some homemade cookies I made, and we would sit there at my small living room table studying those colorful booklets they brought. Roberto was initially a bit suspicious, but then he started participating too. He was a simple man, didn't talk much, but when the sisters explained about paradise on earth, about how there would be no more war, no more death, no more pain, I could see his eyes shine. "Helena," Sister Carmen would say, adjusting her reading glasses, "you have a good heart. God is calling you to understand His truth." Those words echoed in my mind throughout the week. Within 6 months, both Roberto and I were already attending the Kingdom Hall. The hall was in a large adapted house in the Saúde neighborhood, with that characteristic smell of waxed floors and new books. It had about 60 chairs lined up, a small stage in front where there was a dark wooden podium. The walls were white, decorated only with some watchtower pictures. Always impeccable, always organized, always in respectful silence. It was there that I met the family that would change my life, the Santos family. Brother Paulo Santos was an elder, a man of about 50 years old, tall, with very neat hair, always in a dark suit, even in the heat. His wife, Sister Helena, was an elegant woman who spoke softly, always smiled, had 3 small children who were an example of behavior. They were considered a model family in the congregation. Brother Paulo had a natural authority, you know. When he spoke during meetings, everyone stopped to listen. He knew the Bible by heart, quoted texts without even looking, explained complex prophecies with a simplicity that impressed me. I thought, this man really has God's Holy Spirit. "Sister Helena," he would say after the meetings, "I can see that you have potential for spiritual growth. Would you like to have some personal study sessions to deepen your understanding?" Our life changed completely. We stopped celebrating birthdays, Christmas. There were no more June festivals. Carnival was a sin. We stopped talking to relatives who didn't accept the truth. I lost childhood friends who thought I had become fanatical. But it was all okay, my dears, because I believed I was on the right path. The organization taught me that the world was dominated by Satan and that only Jehovah's Witnesses would be saved in Armageddon. The personal studies with Brother Paulo began in the autumn of 1979. He would come to our house on Thursday evenings when Roberto was working the night shift at the garage. He said it was important for me to understand the role of women in God's purpose, that I needed individual guidance to grow spiritually. Roberto trusted him completely. Brother Paulo is helping our Helena become an even better wife, he would say, proud. But there was something in those studies that made me feel strange, uncomfortable. The way Brother Paulo looked at me, the way he positioned himself too close when explaining biblical texts, how his voice became softer when we were alone. He would say things like, "Helena, God has given women a special beauty that needs to be appreciated by those who understand his purpose." I was young, inexperienced, raised to respect authority and never question men of God. When I felt that uncomfortable feeling in my stomach, I told myself it was my own impurity, my own sinful mind seeing evil where there was only spiritual zeal. If you are listening to this story and recognizing something familiar, please know that you are not alone. Sometimes the places where we seek protection are the very places where we need protection from. This is just the beginning of a journey that would teach me that true faith has nothing to do with fear, and that God's love is never conditional on our silence. Let me tell you more about who I was during those years, my dear listeners, because understanding my background is essential to understanding how someone like me could end up in such a situation. I was born Helena Aparecida Ferreira in 1956, the youngest of 4 children. My father, Juan Ferreira, worked 12-hour shifts at the Scania factory, coming home every evening with hands stained with grease and stories about the union meetings. My mother, Conceição, was a woman of few words but immense strength, who raised us with a firm hand and a tender heart. Our house in Vila Luzida was small, 2 bedrooms, a living room that doubled as a dining room, and a kitchen where my mother performed daily miracles, turning beans, rice, and whatever vegetables she could afford into meals that fed 6 people. The smell of coffee was our morning alarm clock, mixed with the sound of the neighbor's radio playing old sambas and my mother humming while preparing breakfast. I was always the good girl of the family. While my brothers got into trouble at school, I was the one who helped my mother with household chores, who studied diligently, who never gave my parents reasons to worry. I learned early that being obedient brought praise, that questioning brought problems. "Helena never gives us headaches," my mother would say to the neighbors. "She's a blessing from God." When I married Roberto in March 1978, I was 22 years old and he was 26. We had met at a church festa, where he shyly asked me to dance to a slow Roberto Carlos song. He was a good man, honest, hard-working, with calloused hands and big dreams. He wanted to open his own garage someday, have 3 children, buy a little house with a yard where we could plant tomatoes and raise chickens. Our wedding was simple but joyful. My mother sewed my dress, white cotton with lace details she had embroidered during the winter evenings. The reception was in my parents' backyard, with homemade sweets, soda, and an accordion player who was a friend of my father's from the factory. Roberto looked at me that day as if I were the most precious thing in the world, and I believed that our love would be enough to face any challenge. We rented a small house 3 blocks from my parents, and I threw myself into being the perfect wife. I woke up before Roberto to prepare his breakfast, ironed his work clothes, kept the house spotless. In the evenings, we would sit on our small front porch, planning our future while watching the neighborhood children play soccer in the street. But I was also extremely naive, my dears. I had been raised to believe that men were naturally wiser than women, that wives should submit to their husbands, that questioning authority was a sin. When the Jehovah's Witnesses arrived at our door, they found a young woman hungry for purpose, eager to please God, and completely unprepared to recognize spiritual manipulation disguised as divine love. Brother Paulo Santos was everything I had been taught to respect in a man. At 48 years old, he had an imposing presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair that gave him an air of wisdom. He wore his suits like armor, always impeccable, always appropriate. His voice was deep and authoritative, but he could make it soft and paternal when the situation required it. "Sister Helena," he would say during the personal studies, "you have a sensitive spirit. God uses women like you to accomplish great things in his organization." His wife, Sister Helena, yes, we shared the same name, which he said was a sign from Jehovah, was the picture of the perfect witness wife. She spoke little during meetings, always deferred to her husband's opinions, dressed modestly but elegantly. Her 3 children, Paulo Jr., 12, Marcos, 10, and little Anna, 8, were like small robots programmed for perfection. They sat still during the entire 2-hour meetings, answered questions with biblical precision, never ran or made noise in the Kingdom Hall. "Look at Sister Helena's children," the other mothers would comment. "See how well behaved they are?" That's what happens when parents truly follow biblical principles. Brother Paulo was known for his special gift for helping new converts understand their role in God's organization. He conducted personal studies with several women in the congregation, always with the full approval of their husbands and the body of elders. He was, after all, a spiritual man, above suspicion, dedicated to helping others grow in faith. The first time I felt something wasn't right was during our fourth personal study. It was a Thursday evening in November 1979, and Roberto was working late at the garage. Brother Paulo arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, as always, carrying his leather briefcase with the study materials. "Sister Helena," he said as he settled into the chair across from me at our small table. "Tonight we're going to study about the role of women in Christian marriage. It's important that you understand how God wants wives to submit to their husband's authority." But as he spoke about submission and obedience, his eyes weren't looking at the Bible. They were looking at me in a way that made me feel uncomfortable, exposed. When he reached across the table to point to a verse, his hand lingered on mine longer than necessary. "You understand, don't you, Helena?" he said, and his voice had become softer, more intimate. "God created women to be beautiful and submissive. It's a sacred responsibility." I told myself it was my imagination, that I was seeing things that weren't there. Brother Paulo was a man of God, an elder, a spiritual father figure. The uncomfortable feeling in my stomach must be my own impurity, my own weak female mind interpreting spiritual guidance as something improper. Roberto trusted Brother Paulo completely. "How lucky we are," he would say, "to have such a spiritual man taking personal interest in your growth. You're going to become an excellent witness wife, Helena." The studies always took place when Roberto wasn't home. "It's important," Brother Paulo explained, "for women to receive specific guidance about their role without the distraction of their husband's presence. The Bible says that women should learn in silence." By December, I had been baptized and was attending all the meetings regularly. The personal studies continued, but now they had a different focus. Brother Paulo said I needed to understand the deeper mysteries of God's purpose for women. "Helena," he would say, adjusting his position in the chair to sit closer to me, "God has given you special beauty. It's important that you learn how to use this gift appropriately, under the guidance of mature Christian men." I was 23 years old, recently married, raised to respect authority, and never question men of God. When Brother Paulo began to touch my shoulder during the studies, explaining that it was brotherly affection, I told myself it was normal. When he started commenting on my appearance, saying that God had blessed me with physical attributes that needed spiritual guidance, I believed it was part of my Christian education. "Roberto doesn't need to know about everything we discuss in our studies," Brother Paulo told me during one winter evening. "Some spiritual matters are better understood between a spiritual shepherd and his sheep. Your husband wouldn't understand the deeper aspects of female submission that I'm teaching you." And I kept silent, believing that obedience to spiritual authority was the same as obedience to God. I didn't know yet that silence in the face of abuse is not a virtue, and that true spiritual guidance never requires secrecy or shame. If you're listening to this and recognizing patterns in your own life, please know that confusion is normal when we're being manipulated by people we've been taught to trust. The most dangerous predators are often those who hide behind religious authority, because they know that faithful people have been trained not to question spiritual leaders. The winter of 1980 marked the beginning of what I now understand was a carefully orchestrated campaign of spiritual and psychological manipulation. Brother Paulo's personal studies with me had become weekly events, always scheduled when Roberto was working late or traveling for garage work in neighboring towns. What had started as biblical instruction gradually transformed into something much darker and more personal. "Helena," Brother Paulo would say as he settled into our small living room, his briefcase always perfectly organized, his suit always impeccable despite the heat. "Tonight we need to discuss something very delicate about your spiritual development." Those words became a warning signal that I learned to recognize but didn't yet understand. Each time he said them, my stomach would tighten with an uncomfortable anticipation. But I was a faithful witness, trained to submit to theocratic authority, taught that questioning spiritual guidance was tantamount to questioning God himself. The lessons began to focus increasingly on submission, obedience, and what he called the sacred mysteries of Christian womanhood. He would quote scriptures about wives being subject to their husbands, about women learning in silence, about the need for female submission to male spiritual authority. But the way he explained these texts felt different from what I heard during Kingdom Hall meetings. The Bible says that women were created as helpers for men, he would explain, his voice taking on that softer, more intimate tone that made me increasingly uncomfortable. But Helena, you have to understand that this help extends beyond just cooking and cleaning. God designed women to provide comprehensive support to Christian men. When I asked what he meant by comprehensive support, he would smile in a way that made my skin crawl and say we would discuss that in future studies. These are deep spiritual matters, Helena. Not every woman is ready to understand the full scope of her biblical responsibilities. Roberto continued to trust Brother Paulo completely. How blessed we are, my husband would say when he came home from work and found evidence of our study session. The coffee cups, the open Bible, the study materials spread across our kitchen table. Brother Paulo is preparing you to be the kind of wife that pleases Jehovah. But Brother Paulo was preparing me for something entirely different. By March 1980, the nature of our studies had shifted dramatically. He began arriving earlier in the evenings, sometimes bringing dinner, so we could have more time for deep spiritual discussion. He would sit closer to me during the studies, occasionally placing his hand on my arm or shoulder while explaining biblical principles. "Helena," he said during one particularly uncomfortable evening, "I've been praying about your spiritual progress, and Jehovah has shown me that you need more personal guidance. Some aspects of Christian submission can only be taught through direct demonstration." I was 24 years old and had been raised to believe that questioning religious authority was a sin. When Brother Paulo began to touch me inappropriately during prayer sessions, explaining that it was part of learning about sacred submission, I told myself that my discomfort was a sign of my own spiritual immaturity. "This stays between us," he would say, after each increasingly inappropriate encounter. Roberto wouldn't understand the deep spiritual principles we're discussing. Some truths are meant only for those who are spiritually mature enough to receive them. The isolation was deliberate and systematic. Brother Paulo began suggesting that I limit my contact with other congregation members who might misunderstand my special spiritual education. He convinced Roberto that I needed to spend more time in personal study and less time in casual fellowship with other sisters. "Helena is being prepared for special privileges in the organization," he told my husband during one of his visits. "She needs focused spiritual training without the distractions of ordinary congregation activities." I found myself becoming increasingly withdrawn from other witnesses, spending more time alone with my thoughts and growing confusion. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. I was supposed to feel blessed by Brother Paulo's special attention, but instead I felt dirty, ashamed, and increasingly desperate to understand why what felt so wrong was being presented as God's will. During this same period, something else was happening that I didn't recognize as connected at the time. Roberto was being gradually marginalized within the congregation. Brother Paulo would make subtle comments about my husband's spiritual limitations, suggesting that his lack of progress in the organization was holding back my own spiritual advancement. "Helena has tremendous potential," Brother Paulo would tell other elders within Roberto's hearing. "It's unfortunate when a spiritually gifted woman is hindered by a husband who lacks vision for theocratic service." Roberto began to feel inadequate, spiritually inferior, convinced that his own limitations were preventing me from achieving the spiritual heights that Brother Paulo promised were within my reach. This created additional pressure on our marriage and made Roberto even more grateful for Brother Paulo's patience in working with his spiritually weak wife. The manipulation was masterful in its subtlety. Brother Paulo never explicitly criticized Roberto, but his constant praise for my special spiritual insights and his gentle disappointment in Roberto's slower spiritual progress created a dynamic where my husband felt indebted to the elder for not giving up on our family. By June 1980, the personal studies had become weekly ordeals that I both dreaded and felt compelled to attend. Brother Paulo had convinced me that resisting his guidance would be tantamount to resisting God's direction for my life. He quoted scriptures about obedience being better than sacrifice, about the dangers of trusting in one's own understanding rather than submitting to those whom God had placed in authority. "Helena," he would say, adjusting his position to sit uncomfortably close to me during our kitchen table sessions, "I can see that you're struggling with some of these deeper spiritual concepts. That's normal. Many women find it difficult to understand their complete role in God's purpose." He had begun bringing what he called advanced study materials, books and articles that weren't available to regular congregation members, materials that he said came directly from the organization's headquarters and were meant only for those being prepared for special responsibilities. These materials focused heavily on submission, sacrifice, and the importance of absolute obedience to theocratic authority. They contained numerous accounts of biblical women who had demonstrated their faith through acts of submission that seemed to contradict their personal comfort or understanding. "Look at Esther," Brother Paulo would say, pointing to highlighted passages in these special publications. "She was willing to risk everything, even her own comfort and safety, to fulfill God's purpose through her. She submitted to arrangements that might have seemed wrong to her limited human understanding." The parallels he drew were unmistakable, though never explicitly stated. Like Esther, I was being asked to submit to arrangements that felt wrong, to trust that spiritual authority knew better than my own understanding, to sacrifice my personal comfort for what was being presented as a greater spiritual purpose. The psychological pressure was immense. Every aspect of my witness training had prepared me to submit to theocratic authority without question. The organization taught that questioning spiritual leadership was pride, that trusting one's own understanding over that of appointed elders was the kind of independent thinking that led to spiritual destruction. But late at night, after Brother Paulo had left and Roberto was asleep, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what I was experiencing with what I had been taught about God's love and protection. The disconnect was becoming impossible to ignore, but I still lacked the framework to understand what was happening to me. During this period, I began to notice other changes in the congregation. Several families with young daughters had moved away suddenly, without the usual farewell gatherings or explanations. When I asked about them, I was told they had received special assignments in other cities, or that they had family obligations that required relocation. Sister Marta, one of the women who had originally studied with me, seemed different when I encountered her at Kingdom Hall meetings. She was quieter, more withdrawn, and she avoided making eye contact with Brother Paulo during his talks from the platform. "Sister Marta seems sad lately," I mentioned to Sister Carmen during one meeting break. Carmen's response was quick and defensive. "Sister Helena, we shouldn't speculate about other people's personal circumstances. Each family faces their own trials and needs to work them out privately." But I had begun to notice patterns. The families that moved away suddenly all had daughters between the ages of 16 and 25. The women who became withdrawn and quiet were all women who had received special spiritual guidance from Brother Paulo. The connections were becoming harder to ignore, even though I still lacked the courage or understanding to name what I was beginning to suspect. The summer of 1980 brought a series of events that would push me toward the moment of truth I had been unconsciously dreading. Roberto received an opportunity to work on a major construction project that would require him to be away from home for 2 weeks. It was good money we needed to start saving for the house we dreamed of buying. When Brother Paulo learned about Roberto's upcoming absence, his reaction was immediate and telling. "This is perfect timing," he said with a smile that made my blood run cold. "We'll be able to have extended study sessions without interruption. There are some very important spiritual principles I've been waiting for the right opportunity to teach you." The way he said it, the look in his eyes, the certainty in his voice, everything about that moment told me that whatever had been building during our months of increasingly uncomfortable encounters was about to reach its inevitable conclusion. For the first time since the personal studies had begun, I felt genuine fear rather than just discomfort. That night, after Roberto had gone to sleep, I sat in our small kitchen with a cup of coffee that grew cold while I tried to sort through my confusion. Part of me wanted to tell Roberto about my concerns, but what would I say? That a respected elder was making me feel uncomfortable during Bible studies? That I was beginning to suspect his motives weren't purely spiritual? I had been so thoroughly indoctrinated to trust theocratic authority that I couldn't even clearly articulate to myself what I suspected was happening. All I knew was that something felt terribly wrong, and that the 2 weeks of Roberto's absence loomed ahead of me like a dark tunnel, with no visible end. What I didn't know yet was that my intuition was correct, and that Brother Paulo had indeed been planning something for those 2 weeks that would finally force me to choose between the silence I had been taught was virtuous and the voice inside me that was growing stronger each day. The voice that insisted that what was happening to me was not God's will, no matter who claimed otherwise. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter my faith in the organization I had trusted with my soul, and would ultimately teach me that sometimes the most important spiritual guidance comes not from those who claim to speak for God, but from the conscience that God placed within each of us to recognize right from wrong. The night arrived, like a dark prophecy fulfilling itself. Roberto had left that Monday morning for his construction project in the neighboring town, kissing me goodbye at the door with promises to call every evening. The house felt immediately different without his presence, larger, emptier, more vulnerable. Brother Paulo had said he would come by that evening for a special extended study session to take advantage of Roberto's absence. I spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation that bordered on panic. Every household task felt mechanical, my hands moving through familiar motions while my mind raced through possible scenarios. I cleaned the house twice, made coffee 3 times without drinking it, and found myself staring out the window at every approaching car, my heart hammering against my ribs. When evening fell and I heard his car pulling into our small driveway, something fundamental shifted inside me. The sound of his footsteps approaching our front door triggered a clarity I hadn't experienced in months of confusion and self-doubt. This was the moment I had been unconsciously dreading and simultaneously preparing for. Brother Paulo knocked on the door at exactly 7 o'clock, as punctual as always. When I opened it, he stood there with his familiar briefcase and his perfectly pressed suit. But something in his demeanor was different. There was an urgency, an anticipation in his eyes that made my stomach turn. His smile was wider than usual, more confident, like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "Good evening, Helena," he said, stepping into our living room without waiting for an invitation. "I trust you've prepared yourself spiritually for tonight's study. We have very important ground to cover." The way he said, "prepared yourself," made every instinct in my body scream danger. But I was still caught in the web of religious conditioning that had been carefully woven around me for 2 years. Even as my intuition shouted warnings, my trained responses kicked in. "Good evening, Brother Paulo," I replied, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "I've made coffee and I have my Bible ready." But he wasn't interested in coffee or Bibles. He set his briefcase down on our kitchen table and turned to face me with an intensity that made me take an involuntary step backward. "Helena," he said, his voice dropping to that soft, intimate tone that had become increasingly familiar and increasingly disturbing. "Tonight is special. Tonight, you're going to complete your spiritual education. You're going to learn the final lesson about submission that will prepare you for your true role in God's organization." The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. In that moment, all the months of growing discomfort, all the suppressed doubts, all the ignored warning signals crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. I understood exactly what he meant, exactly what he intended, and exactly how this evening was supposed to end. "Brother Paulo," I said, and was surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of our Bible studies." His expression changed instantly. The practiced spiritual mentor facade dropped away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. He took a step closer to me, and I could smell his cologne mixed with something else. Anticipation, entitlement, the scent of a man who believed he was entitled to take whatever he wanted. "Helena," he said, and his voice was no longer soft and paternal. It was firm, authoritative, with an edge of threat. You're going to stop pretending that you don't understand what's been building between us. You're going to stop acting like an innocent child and accept your responsibilities as a woman in God's organization. Every word confirmed what I had begun to suspect but hadn't dared to name. This man, whom I had been taught to revere as God's representative, whom Roberto trusted implicitly, whom the entire congregation respected as a spiritual father, was nothing more than a predator who had been grooming me for this moment. "Brother Paolo," I said, taking another step backward until I felt the kitchen wall against my back, "I think you should leave now. Roberto will be calling soon, and I don't think this conversation is appropriate." He laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was the laugh of someone who found my resistance amusing rather than concerning. "Roberto isn't calling tonight," he said with absolute certainty. "I spoke with him this afternoon. There's a problem with the telephone lines at the construction site. He won't be able to call for at least 3 days." The calculated nature of that revelation hit me like ice water. This wasn't a spontaneous moment of inappropriate behavior. This was planned, orchestrated, carefully arranged. He had ensured that I would be isolated, that no one would interrupt, that no one would come looking for me. "You see, Helena," he continued, moving closer despite my obvious distress, "I've been very patient with you. I've spent months preparing you, teaching you, helping you understand your place. But patience has its limits. And tonight, you're going to show your gratitude for all the spiritual guidance I've provided." In that moment, faced with the absolute clarity of his intentions and the full scope of the manipulation I had endured, something inside me broke free. Not broke down, broke free. All the conditioning about respecting authority, all the training about submission, all the fear about questioning spiritual leadership simply evaporated in the face of a truth so clear it couldn't be ignored. "No," I said, and the word came out stronger than I expected. "No, I'm not going to do anything of the kind. What you're talking about isn't spiritual guidance. It's abuse. And I want you to leave my house right now." The change in his demeanor was immediate and frightening. The mask of spiritual authority fell away completely, revealing the true nature of the man underneath. His face darkened with anger, his hands clenched into fists, and he moved toward me with a deliberate menace that made my blood freeze. "You little fool," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you think anyone will believe you if you try to make accusations against me? Do you think your husband will choose your word over mine? Do you think the congregation will support a hysterical woman against their most respected elder?" But his threats, instead of intimidating me, only strengthened my resolve. They confirmed everything I needed to know about his character, about the nature of his authority, about the organization that had elevated him to a position where he could abuse that authority. "Get out," I said, my voice rising. "Get out of my house right now, or I will scream loud enough for every neighbor to hear." He realized that his carefully planned evening wasn't unfolding as expected. The young woman he thought he had thoroughly conditioned to submit to his authority was standing up to him with a determination he hadn't anticipated. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. "Helena," he said, trying to regain control of the situation by returning to his manipulative, paternal tone, "you're making a terrible mistake. You're letting emotion override spiritual wisdom. If you tell anyone about this conversation, you'll destroy your own reputation, your marriage, your standing in the congregation. Is that really what you want?" "What I want," I said, moving toward the kitchen door to put more distance between us, "is for you to leave my house and never come back. What you've been doing to me isn't spiritual guidance, it's grooming, it's manipulation, it's abuse of power, and I won't be silent about it." The finality in my voice seemed to penetrate his shock. He realized that the careful psychological groundwork he had laid over months had failed at the crucial moment. His victim had become his accuser, and his position of authority had transformed into liability. He grabbed his briefcase from the table, his movements sharp and angry. At the door, he turned back to me one final time. "You'll regret this, Helena," he said, his voice cold as winter stone. "You have no idea what you're destroying. And when you lose everything, your husband, your faith, your place in God's organization, remember that you chose this path." After he left, I stood in my kitchen for what felt like hours, shaking with adrenaline and the magnitude of what had just happened. I had faced down a man who held tremendous power over my spiritual life, my marriage, my entire social world. I had chosen truth over convenience, courage over compliance, my own conscience over institutional authority. The telephone rang around 10 o'clock. It was Roberto, calling from a payphone at a gas station. His voice sounded distant but concerned. "Helena, is everything okay? You sound different." "Roberto," I said, and my voice was steadier than it had been in months. "When you come home, we need to talk. There are things about Brother Paulo that you need to know. Things about what's been happening during our Bible studies." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Roberto's voice, careful and uncertain. "What kind of things, Helena?" "Things that will be hard to hear," I replied. "But things you need to know. Things I should have told you months ago." The conversation was brief. Long-distance calls were expensive, and Roberto needed to save his money for the construction project. But before we hung up, he said something that gave me hope for what was to come. "Helena, whatever it is, we'll face it together. You're my wife, and I trust you." As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that my life had fundamentally changed in the space of a single evening. I had discovered that standing up to abuse was possible, even when that abuse came wrapped in religious authority. I had learned that my own conscience was a more reliable guide than institutional doctrine, and I had chosen a path that would require tremendous courage to continue walking. The next morning, I woke up knowing that I would need to tell Roberto everything, that I would need to report Brother Paulo's behavior to the other elders, and that doing so would likely cost me everything I had believed about my faith, my congregation, and my place in God's organization. But I also woke up knowing that silence in the face of abuse is not a virtue, and that protecting institutions at the expense of victims is not faithfulness, it's complicity. The hardest part of my journey was still ahead, but the most important step had been taken. I had found my voice. The days that followed Roberto's return were unlike anything we had experienced in our 2.5 years of marriage. When he walked through our front door that Friday evening, I could see immediately that the man who left for the construction project was not the same man who returned. His face was weathered not just from the physical labor, but from the emotional burden of our telephone conversations during his absence. "Helena," he said simply, setting down his work bag by the door, "tell me everything." We sat at our small kitchen table, the same table where Brother Paulo had conducted his manipulative Bible studies, and I told Roberto everything. Every inappropriate comment, every uncomfortable touch, every violation of boundaries that had been disguised as spiritual guidance. I watched my husband's face transform as I spoke, cycling through disbelief, anger, disgust, and finally, a deep sadness that seemed to age him before my eyes. "My God, Helena," he said when I finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "All this time, I thought I was protecting you by trusting him. I thought I was being a good husband by encouraging your spiritual growth. How could I have been so blind?" Roberto's pain was almost harder to bear than my own trauma. Seeing this good man blame himself for another man's predatory behavior broke my heart in ways that Brother Paulo's abuse never could. But Roberto's response also strengthened my resolve. His immediate belief in my account, his obvious horror at what had been done to me, confirmed that my decision to speak out had been correct. "We have to report this to the other elders," Roberto said, with a determination I had never heard in his voice before. "This man cannot be allowed to hurt other women." But when we approached the body of elders the following Sunday after the meeting, their response was nothing like what we had expected. Elder Martinez, the presiding overseer, listened to our account with an expression of growing concern, not for me, but for the potential scandal this could create. "Brother Roberto, Sister Helena," Elder Martinez said, in the patronizing tone I had learned to recognize, "these are very serious accusations. Brother Paulo is a respected elder with years of faithful service. We'll need to handle this matter very carefully, following proper theocratic procedures." "Theocratic procedures?" Roberto's voice rose. "A man abused my wife, and you're talking about procedures?" Elder Gonzalez, a younger man who had always seemed more progressive, leaned forward. "Brother Roberto, we understand your anger, But we must remember that accusations against an elder require 2 witnesses. The Bible is very clear about this. The 2-witness rule. I had heard it mentioned in meetings before, but never in this context. They were telling us that despite my detailed account, despite the months of documented inappropriate behavior, despite the clear pattern of grooming and abuse, none of it mattered because no one else had witnessed the worst incidents. But there weren't 2 witnesses because he made sure we were always alone, I said, my voice growing stronger with indignation. That's how predators operate. They don't abuse people in front of witnesses. Elder Fernandez, the oldest member of the body, shook his head sadly. Sister Helena, we don't doubt your sincerity, but we must follow biblical principles. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. Brother Paulo is known for his enthusiasm in spiritual matters. Maybe his guidance was misinterpreted. The gaslighting was immediate and systematic. Within minutes, they had transformed me from a victim reporting abuse into a confused woman who had misunderstood well-intentioned spiritual counsel. Roberto stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the Kingdom Hall floor. Misunderstood? His voice echoed in the small library where we were meeting. My wife is telling you that an elder tried to force himself on her, and you're calling it a misunderstanding? Brother Roberto, Elder Martinez's voice carried a warning tone. We need you to calm down and approach this matter with spiritual maturity. Getting emotional won't help anyone. But Roberto was past the point of spiritual maturity. You know what? I don't care about your procedures. We're going to the police. This is a crime, not just a congregational matter. The reaction was immediate and predictable. All 3 elders began speaking at once about bringing reproach on Jehovah's name, about washing dirty laundry in public, about the damage this could do to the congregation's reputation in the community. They painted a picture of a faithful organization being destroyed by one woman's misunderstanding of a spiritual man's intentions. If you go to the authorities, Elder Martinez said with quiet menace, you'll be disfellowshipped for bringing reproach on God's organization. You'll lose your spiritual family, your hope of salvation, everything you've worked for since coming into the truth. The threat was clear and devastating. In their world, being disfellowshipped was worse than death. It meant eternal destruction, complete social isolation, the loss of every relationship we had built in our 2.5 years as witnesses. They were asking me to choose between seeking justice for my abuse and maintaining my place in what I had believed was God's organization. Roberto and I left that meeting in shocked silence. The car ride home was filled with a heaviness that seemed to press down on us from all sides. Everything we had believed about the organization, about spiritual protection, about justice within God's earthly arrangement, had been shattered in the space of a single conversation. Helena, Roberto said as we pulled into our driveway, what do you want to do? It was the first time in our marriage that he had asked me to make a decision of this magnitude. Despite the pain of the situation, I felt a surge of gratitude for this man who was treating me as an equal partner rather than as someone who needed his permission to seek justice. The following week was a period of intense soul-searching and difficult conversations. We talked late into the night about our options, about what we were willing to sacrifice, about what we could live with. We discussed the possibility of changing congregations, of starting over somewhere else within the organization. We considered staying silent and simply avoiding Brother Paulo, hoping he would be transferred or would modify his behavior. But every option that involved staying within the organization felt like a betrayal of other women who might become his victims. How could we protect ourselves while leaving others vulnerable to the same abuse I had experienced? The decision crystallized during a midweek meeting we attended that Tuesday. Brother Paulo was giving a talk about spiritual purity, about the importance of maintaining clean thoughts and behaviors. As I watched him stand behind the podium, speaking eloquently about righteousness while knowing what kind of man he really was, I felt a rage so pure and clear that it burned away all my remaining doubts. After the meeting, as we were walking to our car, Sister Carmen approached us with her usual friendly smile. Sister Helena, Brother Paulo mentioned that you might be interested in resuming your personal studies soon. He said your spiritual progress has been remarkable. The casual way she delivered this message, the assumption that I would want to continue being alone with my abuser, the complete obliviousness to what had transpired, crystallized everything that was wrong with the system we had trusted with our spiritual lives. That night, Roberto and I made our decision. We would leave the organization, report Brother Paulo to the police, and build a new life based on our own understanding of truth and justice, rather than on the interpretations of men who prioritized institutional reputation over individual safety. The process of leaving wasn't simple or immediate. We had to rebuild our entire social network, find new ways to understand spirituality and morality, create meaning and purpose outside the structure that had defined our lives for nearly 3 years. We lost friends, faced criticism from family members who thought we were throwing away our salvation over a misunderstanding, and endured the social isolation that comes with being marked as former witnesses in our community. But we also discovered freedoms we hadn't known we were missing. The freedom to question authority without fear of spiritual punishment. The freedom to form friendships based on genuine compatibility rather than shared religious beliefs. The freedom to seek justice through secular institutions when religious authorities failed us. Most importantly, we discovered that our marriage became stronger when it was based on genuine partnership rather than biblically mandated hierarchy. Roberto never again expected me to submit to authority without question, and I never again doubted my right to speak up when something was wrong. The police investigation into Brother Paulo was lengthy and frustrating. Without physical evidence or additional witnesses willing to come forward, there wasn't enough to pursue criminal charges. But the investigation itself served a purpose. It created an official record. It sent a message to Brother Paulo that his behavior had consequences, and it protected us from potential retaliation from the congregation. 6 months after we left the organization, we learned that Brother Paulo had been transferred to a congregation in another state. No mention was made of why the transfer was necessary. No warning was given to the new congregation about his history. No protection was provided for the women and girls who would now be under his spiritual oversight. The knowledge that he was likely continuing his predatory behavior elsewhere was painful, but it also confirmed that our decision to leave had been correct. An organization that protected abusers while silencing victims was not God's earthly representative, regardless of what they claimed about themselves. Building a new life took time, patience, and a willingness to redefine everything we thought we knew about spirituality, community, and purpose. But within a year of leaving, both Roberto and I could honestly say that we were happier, more authentic, and more genuinely spiritual than we had ever been as Jehovah's Witnesses. As I sit here today, 43 years after that terrifying night when I finally found the courage to say no to Brother Paulo, I'm struck by how that single moment of defiance changed not just my life, but the lives of countless others. The morning light streaming through my kitchen window, the same window where I used to watch for his car with dread, now brings me peace and a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that brought me here. Roberto and I celebrated our 45th wedding anniversary last month. We renewed our vows in a small ceremony in our backyard, surrounded by the family we chose rather than the one we lost. Our children, Maria Elena, 39, and Roberto Jr., 36, both grew up understanding that questioning authority isn't rebellion, it's wisdom. They've raised their own children with the confidence to trust their instincts and speak up when something feels wrong. Mom, Maria Elena told me recently, growing up, I never understood why some of my friends were so afraid to express their opinions at home. You and Dad always encouraged us to think for ourselves, to question everything, to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. That's perhaps the greatest gift that came from our painful exodus from the organization. We learned to value authentic relationships over institutional loyalty, personal integrity over group conformity, individual conscience over organizational doctrine. The work we began all those years ago has grown beyond anything we could have imagined. The support group we started in our living room for former Jehovah's Witnesses now operates in 12 countries with trained counselors who understand the unique trauma of leaving high-control religious organizations. We've helped establish similar programs for former members of other groups, Scientologists, fundamentalist Mormons, members of various cult-like churches that prioritize control over compassion. Last year, we received a letter from a young woman named Patricia who had left the organization after discovering our website. Dear Roberto and Helena, she wrote, I want you to know that your story saved my daughter. When the elders told me to keep quiet about what happened to her, I remembered reading about your experience. I chose my child over their institution, and today she's safe, in therapy and healing. Thank you for showing me that protecting children is always more important than protecting organizations. Letters like Patricia's arrive regularly, each one a reminder that speaking truth to power, no matter how terrifying it feels in the moment, creates ripples that spread far beyond our ability to see or measure. Roberto often jokes that we became accidental activists, but I think we simply became what people become when they refuse to let fear silence their conscience. We learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to do what's right, despite the fear. The organization continues to operate much as it did when we left, though legal challenges in multiple countries have forced some changes in how they handle reports of abuse. Brother Paulo, we learned through various sources over the years, was eventually removed from his position after other women found the courage to speak out. He never faced criminal charges, but he also never again held the kind of authority that allowed him to prey on vulnerable people. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had remained silent that night, if I had allowed him to complete what he had planned. The thought chills me, not just because of what it would have meant for me, but because of all the other women who might have suffered if his behavior had continued unchecked. The most profound lesson I learned is that institutions, even religious ones, especially religious ones, are only as moral as the individuals within them choose to be. When people surrender their individual conscience to group authority, when they prioritize organizational reputation over human welfare, when they follow rules without questioning their impact on the vulnerable, they become complicit in evil, regardless of their good intentions. But I also learned that there are always people willing to stand up, to speak out, to choose courage over comfort. The women who supported me during that terrible period after we left, the police officers who took our reports seriously even though they couldn't prosecute, the therapist who helped us understand that religious trauma is real trauma. They all proved that goodness exists outside institutional structures, that ordinary people can become extraordinary when they choose compassion over conformity. Roberto and I still consider ourselves spiritual people, but our spirituality is no longer mediated by human organizations that claim exclusive access to divine truth. We found God in the courage of abuse survivors who break their silence, in the kindness of strangers who help without expecting recognition, in the love of family members who choose relationship over doctrine. Our home has become a sort of informal sanctuary for people recovering from religious trauma. We keep a guest room ready for those who need a safe place to stay while rebuilding their lives. Our kitchen table, that same table where Brother Paulo conducted his manipulative studies, has been the setting for hundreds of conversations with people learning to trust their own judgment after years of being told that independent thinking is dangerous. Grandma Helena, my youngest granddaughter, asked me last Christmas, why do some people want to control other people so much? Because control feels like safety to people who are afraid, I told her. But real safety comes from teaching people to think for themselves, not from telling them what to think. She nodded with the serious expression that 8-year-olds get when they're processing something important. Is that why you and Grandpa left your church? Because they wanted to control you instead of teaching you? Exactly, sweetheart. And that's why we'll always encourage you to ask questions, even if the questions make adults uncomfortable. As I watch my granddaughters grow up with the confidence to question authority, to trust their instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong, I feel a deep satisfaction knowing that the cycle of silence and submission that trapped me for so many years has been broken in our family. If you're listening to this story and you recognize yourself in it, if you're in a situation where you're being told that questioning leadership is a sin, where protecting institutional reputation is more important than protecting individuals, where your personal worth is tied to organizational approval, please know that there is life beyond those walls. There is purpose beyond their purpose, community beyond their community, spirituality beyond their spirituality. The journey won't be easy, but it will be authentic. The losses will be real, but so will the gains. You might lose the approval of people you love, but you'll gain the approval of your own conscience. You might lose your place in an organization, but you'll find your place in the world. The morning after Brother Paulo left our house for the last time, I sat at my kitchen table watching the sunrise and realized that for the first time in 2.5 years, I wasn't afraid of who might knock on my door. That feeling of freedom, of safety in my own home, of peace with my own decisions. That's what courage looks like on an ordinary Tuesday morning. And today, 43 years later, as I finish telling this story, I still wake up grateful for that terrible, wonderful night when I discovered that my voice was stronger than my fear, and that sometimes the most important spiritual guidance comes not from those who claim to speak for God, but from the still, small voice within us that knows right from wrong. This is a real story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with it. If you also have a story you'd like to share, write in the comments. We would be very happy to tell your story on our channel.